I have great pleasure in welcoming and introducing Bridget Kendall and Gabriel Gatehouse. Bridget is Master of Peterhouse, Cambridge. She is a fluent Russian speaker and was Moscow correspondent for the BBC from 1989 to 1995. She was eyewitness to some of the most momentous events in Russia in recent years, and amongst other things, I believe has interviewed Boris Yeltsin not once but twice. She is the first woman to win the prestigious James Cameron Award for Distinguished Journalism in 1992 and was made an MBE in 1994. I'd also like to introduce Gabriel Gatehouse, who is a foreign correspondent for the BBC and who started his career in the Russia service in the BBC. He has, as well as covering events in Russia, covered extensively events in the Middle East and the Far East, and in 2012 won the Royal Television Society Award for his reporting on the Rohingya disaster for Newsnight. More perhaps closer to home, in 2011, he won a Sony Gold Award for his coverage of the wedding of the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge. We are lucky to have them speaking for 45 minutes. We will then have 50 minutes for questions afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So it's a particular pleasure for me to be back in conversation with Gabriel because our careers have intersected at various points, usually to do with Russia.
Almost to do with Russia. I think I was going to Russia for the first time just about the time you were leaving as Moscow correspondent. And I go back quite regularly still, I think.
Well, that's very nice for me because since I've got my new job at Cambridge in 2016, I haven't been back to Russia. I've been too busy in Cambridge. So, but Gabriel, you were there a couple of weeks ago.
I was there a couple of weeks ago. I was there in January. And if we're talking about Russo-British relations, I think probably it's no secret to most people here that they're not in a great state at the moment. As Russians see it, there is a lot of paranoia in this country about what the Russians are up to, and a feeling that the Brits, certainly the British establishment, ascribe to them all manner of perfidious deeds. And indeed, you know, we have had some of these examples, the poisoning of the Skripals, etc., etc. When you speak to Russian diplomats and people in positions of power in Russia, even privately, you get this really strong sense of a duality. There's both a sense that they want to convey that they feel that Britain is no longer a powerful nation, and slightly pathetic even, that you definitely get that. But at the same time, this idea that we are utterly perfidious and trying to do them down and pulling the strings behind the scene to try and keep Russia contained. So you get this dual attitude, and it's both very tiring and a shame in a way, especially for somebody like me who came first to Russia at a time when, even though times were difficult in the mid-90s, there was a lot of kind of mutual respect, I think. But I saw a quote at the beginning of the exhibition from Lord Melbourne, who's speaking to the future Tsar Alexander II, which I thought was a brilliant quote. It said, "Two nations forced to love, esteem, and admire each other." Now, it really doesn't feel like that at the moment. But I wonder what it felt like to you, Bridget, when you first went in...
In the mid-1970s.
Yeah.
So that was from the mid-19th century, that quote, yes?
Yes.
So 1970s, we're talking about right in the middle of the Soviet period. I went there as a student for a year in 1976 to 77 and back again in 1981 to 82, just before Brezhnev died. Forced to, what was the quote again?
Esteem, admire, and love.
Yes. No, not really. It was the height of, I mean, actually, I didn't realise it was the height of the Cold War, and this is interesting about if you're thinking about the passage of history and relations between two countries, because I thought at that moment, when I arrived in 1976, we were in détente. It was the era of so-called détente. Ostpolitik had just got underway to improve relations between the two Germanys. Nixon had been not just to China, but he'd been to Moscow, and arms negotiations got underway again. And of course, most importantly, there had been the Helsinki Final Act, the Helsinki Accords that came at the end of the negotiations, which it was felt were pushing relations on a much better track. And I think there was a feeling that the danger of a hot world of the Cold War had receded. Both sides had realized that it was too dangerous to contemplate pressing the nuclear button, mad range, mutually assured destruction as a doctrine. And therefore, there was a sort of tacit agreement on both sides that they're probably not going to go to war. The high point, if you like, was the Cuban Missile Crisis of '62. And by the mid-1970s, it just felt like everything was being regularized. Of course, subsequently, what we found out was that it only appeared like that, and actually relations were steadily getting worse. And the conflicts had been exiled to the periphery. So this, what was then called the Third World, regional conflicts in Angola began in '75, whole of Central America, and then, of course, in Afghanistan. And the big change came in 1979 when the Soviets went into Afghanistan. The kind of Crimea moment of its day, if 2017, Russians annexing Crimea, has defined today's UK-Russian or Russia-West relations, then in those days, the big jolt came when we suddenly woke up to the fact that relations had steadily been getting worse.
And as you were saying earlier,
just like in our era.
As you were saying earlier, these themes of Afghanistan and Crimea just keep cropping up.
It's really amazing,
again.
actually, and this exhibition brings that back. That points of tension between Britain, particularly Britain, and Russia are, on the one hand, Crimea. In the 18th century, Pitt the Younger was very worried about what the Russians were doing. Catherine was busy turning the Khanate in Crimea into her fiefdom. There's the most fantastic map, by the way, in the British Library, which shows, it's got a beautiful picture of Catherine the Great and the Crimea and the Ottomans and the Crimean Tatars, that moment when he was shifting into Russia's orbit. Then, of course, the Crimean War in the 19th century. It's a wonderful picture downstairs by a female artist of the soldiers from the Crimean War, which so imprinted itself on the British public's.
Very powerful.
And of course, it's very important because of the role of Florence Nightingale. And then, in our era, the Crimea has come back again. But the same with Afghanistan. The worry about Russian aims in Central Asia, stretching across from the Middle East, and then in South Asia, Afghanistan, what is now India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. And that, of course, came back. So actually, looking at history helps you understand that when these resonances happen in our age, maybe we're not even quite aware of how important history is, but it's there underneath. Some people remember, the historians remember, but for the rest of us, it's a subterranean tension which just comes back again.
I'm interested to hear a little bit from you about how people, just ordinary people, interacted with you when you were a student out there in the 70s, because I've noticed from the first time I started going to Russia in the mid-90s to today, a marked change in the way people reacted to me, both as a Brit and as a BBC correspondent. In the mid-90s, you got a lot of respect for being a BBC person. You don't get that now. You really don't. You get, and the Russian state has very effectively sold the narrative that the BBC is kind of the same as RT, Russia Today, that it is a state broadcaster, and therefore just a mouthpiece of the state. It's basically state propaganda. And of course, from their point of view, you can understand why they would believe that, because it's very difficult for them to believe that the state broadcaster would not be taking orders from number 10 Downing Street. But from the time when you were reporting on the coup and Gorbachev in his Crimean dacha, who came out afterwards and said, I found out what was going on by listening to the BBC's Russian service. The attitude...
He always would give me an interview. He'd say, I'll always give you an interview because of the coup.
Because
of the BBC, yeah.
Wait, you were great. Behind the coup?
No. But so there are two things, aren't there? There's the Soviet era and how rare Western visitors were treated, so we were students. We were treated like people from outer space. Especially I was in a provincial town, and people had very little idea of what was going on, the facts of what life was like in the West. they would say things like, how many cows does your father have? And as a measure of wealth. And it was very rural.
But you know what, in the 90s you got the same stuff. I studied in Petrozavodsk, which is sort of north of St. Petersburg, sort of northwest Russia, logging town. This was the late 90s, actually, and I remember they invited me to their dacha, and I said how lovely it was for this Russian tradition that people have these summer houses, these dachas that they could go to and grow, and they're usually they're allotments, they're little wooden shacks.
They needed them in the 90s. There's nothing they could afford to buy.
What a lovely luxury this was for you lot, that you have this tradition. And she said to me, but in the West, you have villas. And I tried to dig a little bit into where she, what do you mean villas? So it turned out that they were getting their information from a program called Beverly Hills 90210. Anyway.
Yeah, no, but I think this theme of prosperity is an interesting one, because when people did glean information from the West and they understood from the clothes we students had that we had things they didn't have. In those days, jeans and biros and automatic umbrellas were very popular. Makeup and latest music and all kinds of things. And they didn't have that. So it was very difficult for the Soviet state to say they lived in a better world when they could see tangibly that we had things they didn't have. But nowadays, that's all gone, because Russia's now a market economy and it functions. You can get better stuff in. It might even be cheaper, it might even be better made, depending on where it came from and what you're talking about. In Russia, I was talking just on Tuesday to one of our students who's going to Novosibirsk for a year, and I said, well, you must be careful. You must think about getting warm enough clothes, because you just would be miserable if you're too cold. You need a really, really warm coat, and don't be scared, wear fur, because really in Siberia nothing does it except fur, in my experience. And I was sort of saying, good place to go, is Helsinki, thinking back to my time. And she said, no, I'll wait till I get to Novosibirsk and then I'll find a Russian to take me to the shops.
It's probably quite right.
We'll probably find things that are suitable. And that's so different now. And I think that does inform, for those of us who are old enough to remember the Soviet Union, there was a certain complacency in those days that we knew our world was better. And we knew our world worked better. And, of course, in many ways it did, because the Soviet Union was so nonsensical and dysfunctional. That was true, both on the propaganda level and on the way politics was organised and on the way the economy worked. And nowadays, it's not always quite so clear. It's not that clear.
But I remember saying as a sort of green and perhaps slightly idiotic student in the 1990s to one of our teachers at Kazan State University, and I said to her something idiotic, like, but back in the Soviet Union, you had to queue up for cabbages, and now you've got everything in the shops. She said, yes, we have got everything in the shops, but most of us can't afford it.
Yeah.
And that, I think that experience of the 90s, to me it felt like, and now it feels like, many Russians saw that not just as a betrayal of the promise of what could happen after the Soviet Union, but specifically a Western betrayal, and I think we include Britain in that, as this system that held out this promise and that then didn't deliver or only delivered for a very few.
Yeah.
I think that plays in very strongly to that sort of psychological element plays in very strongly to this low point that we've reached now in relations, and the fact that if I speak to the Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova, I can guarantee you that she will literally be shouting at me within 45 seconds, and it's quite noticeable that there is a lot of anger, and I think it stems from that moment in the 90s where things started to go horribly wrong, when you were interviewing Yeltsin twice.
Well, no, Mr. Putin was the one I interviewed.
Right.
But yes, I think, I get a little frustrated when Russians today say, oh, it was so much better in the Soviet Union. Because the year I spent in Voronezh in the mid-1970s, it was not better. It was tedious, it was boring, it was stultifying for everybody. The state ran everything, it decided what job you did. All the, we shared 4 people to a room, so we were pretty crowded in the hostel, character forming for 10 months. 2 Russians, 2 Brits, and at the end of the year, they were all weeping, the Russian girls, because they were being sent off to work in faraway village schools up to their knees in mud to pay back for their university education. No choice at all. And then after that, whatever job they got after that, there'd be no choice. And getting things to eat was difficult. We used to go around hunting in shops. There was no meat, there was no fish, there were no fresh vegetables in the winter. You couldn't even buy a needle to darn your cardigan. I once said, I need to darn my clothes, I'm just going down to the shop to buy a needle. They all laughed at me. So don't be so stupid, you can't buy that.
But of course...
They were so deprived, and people have forgotten, and they hear the stories from their grandparents, and it's through rose-coloured spectacles. Very often it's about life in Moscow and not in the provinces. And I think that I understand the frustration of people who feel they can't afford things now. But actually, there was a lot of things worked on the black market in those days, and it was also a question of what you could afford and, of course, who you knew, because if you had an in into the party, then you got hold of things that other people didn't get. So I feel quite sorry, really, that history's been rewritten in that way. And it comes on to another point, which was one thing about being in the Soviet Union, was after a while, you tried to navigate to past the official view, because you've been talking about Russian officials, to the private view. And there was this huge gap between them, people who would be really monosyllabic and never smile at you in an official capacity. If for some reason you managed to go home with them, they would be so warm and lovely and quite critical of their country. And that, I don't know if that exists now.
Well, I think actually it did for a long time, but I think the slightly surreal nature of Putin's Russia post 2012, post his return for his 3rd presidency, and especially post Crimea and eastern Ukraine, where official Russia has played this kind of knowing, wink, wink, nudge, nudge game of, little green men in Crimea, nothing to do with us, and then a year later saying, well, of course it was us.
And we'll give them medals.
And we'll give them all medals. And Russians are expected to, when they see the little green men going into Crimea and they hear the official denials, of course they also know this is rubbish, but they have to juggle these 2 realities in their heads at the same time. They have to both believe the denials of the state, but also they're knowing, then they're not idiots, and so what you get is this kind of dual reality that I've been doing working on a 5-part series about this guy Vladislav Surkov for Radio 4, who is the man credited with creating Putinism, this sort of Machiavellian, semi-democratic state. And he really pioneered what I think has since morphed into what we like to call the post-truth world. This idea whereby you saw a democracy, and yes, it had all the props and the actors. It had democratic elections. It had opposition parties. It had a vibrant press. But all of them were in a way just stage props. And so now what you have is instead of Russians being able to separate their public persona and beliefs and their private, if they thought no one was listening, into 2 separate things, you've got people are confused because they can say anything they want, but these 2 things are swimming together in the same pool, and it's very confusing. And I notice it with my friends who would describe themselves as liberals, would probably not describe themselves as Putin supporters, but at the same time, I will have conversations with them like they will say, do you really believe that Russia had anything to do with Skripal? I don't think so, And I mean, I don't know. I don't have independent sourcing on the Skripal thing, but, just look at Russia's recent form. It's not a stretch of the imagination at all. But my Russian liberal friends are really wrestling with this because I think truth and fiction and these 2 sides of the Russian psyche that they got so adept at separating under Soviet times have got really mixed up now, and I think it's difficult.
Well, I suppose in this country we can sympathise with that more now than we might have done, because we're in a very confusing moment. I was on the train on the way here. I made a list of things, ways in which I thought, if only Russia and Britain could get on better, actually we've got lots in common. I mean, it's true, though, because for a start, there are, I mean, just on a superficial level, there are the royal links, there are the cultural affinities, how much we like each other's literature and culture, particularly things like children's literature, which goes very deep into a nation. And that's part of the story that we do in the end see Russia as part of the European mainstream culturally.
And Russia's us. I mean, you can go to an estate on the outskirts of a provincial town, and you will have a sensible conversation with someone about Shakespeare.
Yeah, and we were wartime allies. That was very important for them. It is for some people here too. But then there are other ways in which we these common strains that come back, not just places like Crimea and Afghanistan, but actually we also have lots of ways in which we sort of face the same challenges, or we have things that run through our lives and our country's lives, which seem to me rather similar. So our sense of our historical identity, and you can see this in this exhibition, running through history, it's very tied up with monarchy. So, 1,000 years of Russian history is partly about 1,000 years of the Russian Orthodox Church, but it's also about Prince Vladimir, who converted. So it's that line of monarchy that runs straight down from history to today, which is what makes you feel that you're Russian. And similarly, I think in this country, we as children, we learn about the kings and queens. It's not just back to...
We divide our periods.
It's Alfred burning the cakes. It goes back a very, very long way. So that's very interesting because, of course, and it's so strong, this identity, if you think about it, that both nations could even have German monarchs. And it doesn't shake their identity. So we had the Germans in the 18th century, and they had Empress Catherine, who was a totally signed-up German.
But the key difference on the monarchy side of things, of course, is that we had a revolution, then brought them back, and they had a revolution.
Yeah, so we both had revolutions. Ours was in the 17th century, didn't last very long. We reverted to the monarchy. The Russians had a revolution. They lost their monarch. Well, their monarch was executed. Our monarch was executed. And then they had 70 years of Sovietism, and now they haven't got a monarchy back.
Although they do have Putin.
Exactly. They have Putin because they sort of want a Tsar.
Yeah.
And
but
so
the problem is they don't have
he's
got no heir.
Every time he gets re-elected, look at the coronation. Yeah. It's a Tsar's coronation. That's all the trappings are there. And, maybe part of the confusion you're talking about is about a country which had its guts ripped out of it in terms of identity by the Soviets. They didn't even have a nationhood. It was Soviet. It was another entity. It was the Soviet citizen. It wasn't the Russian.
Well, they developed into quite a strong sense of identity, I think.
Yeah, but I mean, as soon as it was possible after the Soviet Union collapsed, people tried to recreate Russianness. And that's what Putin's trying to do too. But actually, it turns out monarchy is very important, and it's not there. So that's one of many reasons that makes me think we're looking at Russia in transition, and we don't know where that's going. But then there are other things that I think are just sort of beguiling when you think about Russia and Britain that we have in common. I mean, this is also, this isn't a new thought, but it's an interesting one to play with, is about the Post-Imperial Syndrome. So that we're both empires, we're both struggling with the fact we're no longer empires. Britain lost its empire after the end of the Second World War through exhaustion. It just had to give it up. And then there was the Commonwealth, and now, some people say, well, we can get the Commonwealth back. Well, frankly, the Commonwealth has moved on. Go to Australia and New Zealand, they may debate very much how much they should trade with China, but they're looking at their neighbourhood. And the Russians, similarly, it's very hard for them Putin, we see that all the time. He doesn't think these are proper countries around the edge.
He said it about Ukraine.
Yeah, he thinks they're still part of his empire. And then this leads to a difficulty in identity that, what's Russianness? When every ninth Russian is a Muslim and a non-Russian. And similarly in this country, are we British? Are we English? Are we one nation? Are we four nations? It's a post-imperial problem of Are we a federation? Are we a single unitary state? Russia also says it's a federation, but it behaves like a single unitary state. And actually, it's really quite interesting. If only we could admit this about ourselves to each other, we could have quite a useful conversation.
Why we should all be more like the Germans, right? So where we look at our history boldly in the face. I would argue, in a way, that the Russians are almost slightly better at getting over their post-imperial hangover than we are. I would suggest, especially in this kind of sort of rather frenzied Brexit period, where we seem to be coming face to face with some rather hard realities about our ability to project power abroad and get people to do what we want them to do. I would say that maybe the Russians have faced that a little bit more directly as a result of the fall of the Soviet Union, of the collapse of the Soviet Union. I was very struck, I was thinking about this on the way in, that you talked about monarchy being a sort of thread that runs through it and provides with a sense of national identity or historical identity. But the Russians, of course, cut that off and didn't bring it back. And perhaps that's one of the key differences, that sense of continuity has been lost, that absolute sense of two breaks, 1917 and 1991, and the chaos that was the 90s. And if you look at RT, for example, the Russia Today, this channel that is a propaganda channel, it's got a very clever slogan, which is question more. It's a propaganda channel aimed at Britain and America, but Britain a lot. It's question more. And I think that's very clever, because we do need to question more. All the best propaganda comes from an element of truth, right? We do need to question more. We need to confront our own history more in Britain to find out who we really are. The Russians, in a way, have been so forced to question. They had to question the validity of the Soviet Union massively after it collapsed and realized that it was entirely rotten from the inside. Then they questioned the capitalism that they adopted throughout the 90s because it was so chaotic. And now they've realized that actually they don't believe anything because everyone's lying to them. So they've been through that, whereas we're kind of just starting, I think. And they're looking at us. So that's where this fascinating character of Vladislav Surkov, Putin's Rasputin, you get the sense of him kind of looking at the West in its sort of contorted difficulties over Brexit and Trump and this sort of post-truth world, and sort of looking at us and slightly smirking and thinking, we've been here already, we've been through this, now you see how you like it.
So this is becoming a conversation not about Russia, but about us.
Well, it's about
but it's an interesting one, because it comes down to the question of values. So the Soviet Union had an ideology which didn't work, and lots of people in the later Soviet Union anyway, when they would reach their teenage years, would look around and say, this doesn't work, this isn't an equal society. There are all those party members who have special shops and things, or my father's been penalised at work and it's not fair. Suddenly I realise this world doesn't work. And then you have the private sphere and the public sphere, and gradually the cynicism or the disenchantment grows to the extent that when Gorbachev lifts the lid just a little, when he comes in 1985, the lid blows off because there's so much frustration, pent-up frustration, and private criticism that it can't last. But that was right, because the Soviet Union didn't really work, and the values that it espoused, it didn't live by. The question is, the values that Western societies have, is Mr. Putin right when he says, well, you say you have these values, but you don't live by them. You say you have human rights, you don't really. Britain, the epitome of hypocrisy, and so on. And we may not be perfect, but you're no better. In fact, in some ways, you're worse because you're not frank about it, which is your point.
That's the very centre of Russian foreign policy.
But I think, lots of people think, no, that's not true. There are values. Maybe we don't live up to them, but we aspire to them. And actually, the big question about Russia today is, perhaps there are a lot of people in Russia who'd like to think like that, but they're not really allowed to. They're expected to play along with a narrative. You say, question more. Well, in Putin's Russia, there are lots of things people aren't allowed to question. If they start to challenge cast aspersions on the Russian state or the Russian presidency, they run the risk of being hauled off to the courts for a Twitter comment.
Well, I think that the clever thing about Putin's Russia is actually most people are allowed to question most things, although they're not allowed on some platform. So you won't be allowed to question certain things on state-controlled television, for example. But you'd be free to do so in an online newspaper or even some print newspapers.
Until you're not, and then suddenly you're in trouble.
And until you start pulling at the financial threads, and then it's curtains. So as you get close to that, that's it. You're right. But you can question more. It's just that your questioning isn't going to do it's going to change anything. You know this, that it's not going to change anything. I think that's one of the differences.
I mean, an interesting thing that I see in Russia today is it comes back to this idea of national identity. That's something very, very... I remember Putin, I used to go to a yearly conference run by the Kremlin when Putin would talk to us at length at the end of it. It's called the Valdai Conference. And one year he said, and this was about 2011, I think it was 2011, so it was just before those massive protests when people came out on the street and said, "We want you to go, Mr. Putin," which was a moment when the emperor began to lose his clothes, which I think profoundly shocked him.
He thought it was Ukraine. He thought it was an orange revolution.
He thought he was out, and said he managed to win the next election, and announced his victory with tears running down his cheeks. His press secretary later said, "Oh no, it was a cold wind. It wasn't emotional." Anyway, so there he was, and he said the thing about Russia today is that it's too cynical. You know, people are sold on materialism in the post-Soviet world. Now we've lost Soviet ideology. It's all evaporated. And people just think you just need to get rich, you need to make money, and they haven't got an idea that holds the nation together. So I've been working and thinking, what should our idea be? And we need to have a sort of Russian, he's talking about values. He's talking about something to make the nation, for people to really feel enthusiastic and passionate about and not have this empty cynicism you're talking about. And he talked about nationhood and religion, and that out of this came the even closer relationship with the Orthodox Church. 2 years later, there's the whole debacle in Ukraine, not unconnected to all of this. And they push the idea now of Russian nationhood, and you get these after-school clubs where children are trained to fight and use rifles, and even taken off to Ukraine to fight. Yeah, I've been too. And the young children and the teachers there really sincerely believe in Holy Mother Russia, and they say we are preparing for a holy war. So there is a sector of the population. I mean, I suppose they remind me of the Trump true believers. The kind of 20% who just buy into this idea, but you kind of think you can't really believe it.
I went to one of these camps it was quite recently. It was when was Trump elected? 2016. Yeah. So I went to one of these. It was just before the election, and we were doing a piece for Newsnight about Russians who are preparing for a Third World War conflict with America, and so we went to one of these. It was run by the party Rodina, it's a nationalist, I mean, motherland party. Young kids, teenagers, paintballing basically, but with a sort of, with a nod and a wink that, once you've learnt to paintball, you can use a Kalashnikov. And great telly pictures, looked like, Russians preparing for war. Then afterwards, I went to talk to the teenagers, and I was like, "Oh yes, does it feel very tense to you?" And they're like, "No, not really." And I was like, "But you watch television, and they've got all these reports about America." They were like, "You watch Russian television? We don't watch Russian television. It's all full of nonsense." So I had high hopes for the new generation of Russians that they could both go paintballing paid for by the state and then ignore all of this nonsense. So maybe it's just us older people that are pushing this narrative.
I think it is a very big question about Russia today. What people, you were talking about this dual mentality of, on the one hand, wanting to stick up for your country and not believe that they could do something so awful as poison these people in Salisbury. And on the other hand...
They're proud that they did go and poison. That is literally the two things that are happening. How could you believe that we would do that? Isn't it great how clever our security services are? Or then, when they massively messed it up, it's a bit embarrassing. So there's this weird dichotomy, these two ideas that cannot both be true, and yet they're sort of holding them in their heads at the same time. It's a very, very odd place to be. But I wanted to pick up on something that you said earlier. You were talking about transition and Putin. We were talking about the fact that there was no heir, that there is no obvious replacement for him. And this is the driving force or the stultifying force in Russian politics, because sometimes in the West we think of the Kremlin as this very monolithic thing where Putin decides everything and tells everyone what to do. But it's not really like that. There's lots of factions in the Kremlin. They call them the towers of the Kremlin, Bashny Kremlia, and they fight each other for influence and control. But Putin, if you like, is the institution through which they all exercise power, and without Putin, they don't have a means to exercise power. And they need to.
He's the Tsar.
He is the Tsar.
You can't declare who the next king is till the king is dead, right?
But at least if the king's got a son, you know he's going to be. But with Putin, you don't know. And actually, I think all of the, or not all of the, but a lot of the entrenchment and the souring of relations that you see between Russia and the West is due to the fact that they don't know where they're going. They've got no succession plan, so they need to keep pushing harder. They need to keep pushing. So the liberalism goes. You will remember this, that when Putin first came in, there was talk of Russia joining NATO.
Yeah.
This was, I mean, that would be absolutely unthinkable these days. NATO is portrayed in Russia as their greatest enemy, that is constantly pushing in on their borders, encircling them. And incidentally, this is a narrative that I suspect through RT and other means is seeping into the British kind of alternative consciousness. If you speak to a lot of Corbyn supporters, you will hear that narrative that comes out. That NATO's encircled Russia. Young people, I've got a nephew like that, and I'm like, where is this coming from? And I think it's coming from there. And it's all happening because they've got no succession. There's no idea of any way forward. So it's this kind of conservatism that.
I remember once talking to a Russian political scientist who she'd been an advisor to Yeltsin. You probably know her, Lilia Shevtsova. She became. She was sort of close to. She was a very respected figure in Moscow through the 90s, and she was around with early Putin. He had a lot of liberal advisors in those days, economic advisors, because he was trying to have a better sort out the Russian economy to get people to pay taxes and make the country more profitable again. And he did it amazingly with the help of high oil prices as well, of course. But she was wary of him, but I think she could see good things. She could see that the people who were initially around him were doing the right thing, and he was trying to reach out to the West to get investment. He was prepared to forgive NATO for having gone into Kosovo without a UN resolution, by the way, and over Russia's objections. So that was quite a big thing for Putin to do, to try and make friends with the West again, but just when he first came in. And I remember in, I think 2003, I remember seeing her and she said, it's no good, it's not going to work. He's taking us down a blind alley, down a tupik. And I said, why? She said, because he's taken the low-hanging fruit of economic reforms. He brought in a flat tax, so people began to pay income tax for the first time. He'd done a few other things, regularized some things. And she said, now he has to do the hard stuff. Now he has to bring in various reforms which will really liberalize the economy. And he daren't let go. And therefore, he's just doing what everyone in Russia has always done through the Soviet Union, which is retain this very strong central control so that you're in charge, because you don't let go, because then you're not in control anymore. And she said, we'll never develop. We'll never get out of this.
This was 2003, because that's when Khodorkovsky happened.
It was just before Khodorkovsky was arrested. It was just before he sacked his reformist prime minister, Mikhail Kasyanov. He'd inherited from Yeltsin, known as Misha 2%, because everyone thought he was on the take, but he was a reformer. And he brought in a terrible prime minister called Fradkov, who was totally, as we used to say, unreconstructed, and set the whole thing down a course which we're now on, where if you look back on it, you could say Putin had a choice between the economic reformers, some of whom are still circling around him a bit, and what are known as the Siloviki, the people who ran the security apparatus. That's the army, the KGB, the Interior Ministry troops, the same people who organized the coup against Gorbachev pretty well.
Yeah.
In 1991. And they said to him, you can't let go of control. And that was his background, as KGB man. And even though he brought in Medvedev for 4 years as a sort of stand-in president while he was prime minister between 2008 and 2012, he didn't really let go. And I remember being at a meeting where he said, well, I'm giving you Medvedev as a president. He's younger than me. He's a different generation. He comes from a different background. This is your test in the West to see if you can collaborate with him. Well, it wasn't a real test because he was never going to let go. And
you were telling me about 2008 when Georgia happened.
Yeah, so that's there. No, well, we were talking on the phone before about this. So Medvedev comes in, this puppet president, and Georgia has a very excitable president called Georgi Saakashvili. Some of you may have seen the YouTube clip of him eating his tie.
On BBC.
They like to show that on RT a lot. The Russians claimed that he started a clash in South Ossetia, so they had to send troops in. And they'd been having exercises on the borders with tanks since April, so they were poised to go in. But we know that story now. That's exactly what they did with Ukraine. So, the Russians can hardly be said to be innocent in this game. Anyway, it all happened the moment when the Russian invasion was announced, at the time of the Beijing Olympics, and Putin as prime minister was in Beijing. So he was several hours ahead of Russia when they rang him up and said, what are we to do? Send in the tanks.
So he makes the decision,
even though he was prime minister in charge of the economy, the president, meanwhile, young Dmitry Medvedev, was on holiday fishing on the Volga River.
But have you noticed how Dmitry Medvedev speaks exactly like Putin? He's adopted his clipped vocal mannerisms. It's like he's...
Well, he's got no choice either.
Well, exactly.
They're all stuck in Ukraine. Anyway, I was at a meeting with him as part of this conference that year, and he said, no, I'm very frustrated. I don't want to be a war president. I want to deal with the Russian economy. That's what I like doing. But I was rung up by the defense minister who told me we've invaded Georgia. So that's the way Russian politics
I don't think he really
works,
wants to be president at all. But in 2012 or 2011, when just before those protests happened that you spoke about earlier, there was a real question for a little while about whether Medvedev was going to stay and whether the elites in Moscow were going to achieve keeping Medvedev in place, and that could have sent this whole topic that we're talking about, Russia-West relations, down a very different alley. I think it's 1:45. We should stop waffling.
Talking to each other. Yes, take some questions.
Right. Anyone who wants to ask anything, put your hand up, and I think there's a microphone at the back. 2 microphones at the back. Don't be shy. Yes, you, sir.
Hi. I am a Russian person who lives in Britain for many, many years. Actually, when you were a BBC correspondent in Russia. Sorry, lost my voice a little bit. And I also lived in Ukraine, Gabriel. And I think that we all agree that the situation around between Russia and UK has really started from the Maidan, right? Which you were actually covering in a very good manner for somebody like me who lived there for many years and knows the situation very well and can relate to both British view and Russian view and Ukrainian view. I thought that you were actually one of the very few people who understood the situation very well.
That's very kind.
So now to the question. During Maidan period, it was kind of up and down over time, and whenever it would be coming down, suddenly every time somebody would almost like throw in a match, and another shooting would happen, another explosion, something constantly kept on happening in exactly the right time, right? And out of probably the most, these events, the most prolific one was, of course, shooting of people on Maidan, which is still kind of not really clear who. But I think the answer to that question really indicates the power play of that situation, right? So for me, it's very interesting considering that you are there and you're a BBC correspondent. What is your view? Who was actually shooting from Hotel Ukraine?
I know they shot at us, actually. We were outside, we were staying in the Hotel Ukraine, and that morning, the 20th of February 2014, 5 years ago yesterday, it started in a crazy way. I was woken up by gunshots. I went out and looked out the window. I saw a protester lying face down on the cobbles. I couldn't swear that I could see the blood, but anyway, he was dead. He'd been shot. And another protester ran up and dragged him by the legs and pulled him to cover. We went down. It was very, very confusing, but most of the shooting was happening at street level between the riot police and special interior ministry forces and the protesters, most of whom didn't have guns, most of whom just had sort of baseball bats and pointless plywood shields. But then at some point, suddenly I saw a curtain twitch up on the sort of 18th, 19th floor of this hotel, and a shot rang out, and it was definitely coming in our direction. And it seemed like somebody from there was shooting at both sides. That is the sort of conclusion that I came to. I went back a year later. I met a guy who claimed that he was one of the protesters and that he'd actually fired one of the early shots. He said he'd met a shadowy figure on Maidan a few weeks earlier who'd sort of groomed him. That's the way he put it. He'd said, you know, if it comes to it, are you ready? And then somebody had given him a shotgun. He'd fired from the conservatory building just around the corner. But it's very difficult to figure out exactly what happened. But there was definitely a sense that there were two forces: the protesters and the riot police, and then there was this kind of third force, and that is slightly borne out by recordings of snipers that have since come out, and one pair of snipers that obviously was unknown to the government snipers who were all around. The Ukrainians claim that Russia organized these snipers. Ukraine and Russia at war. You know, there's a lot of propaganda going on both sides. My answer to you is I don't know. What I do know is that, you know, I covered Maidan, the protests there, and then I covered Crimea, and then I covered eastern Ukraine. I was in Slavyansk when the policemen took over the police. Now, I can tell you that Maidan was a real revolution. There were people there, they were normal people. I was just revisiting some of the footage just the other day. It was sort of families gathering sacks of cobblestones to build barricades. This is on the 19th of February, the day before this happened. I can tell you that the stuff that happened in eastern Ukraine, in Slavyansk, and even more so in Crimea, that was not a people's revolt. that was a rebellion by some people for sure were locals, but local security forces. And then there were Russians that came in as well. So there was a qualitative difference to those two rebellions, if you like. Now, as to your question as to whether somebody brought Maidan to a head on purpose, I don't know. I genuinely don't know.
But do you think it's a real possibility?
Of course it's a real possibility. Sure. Yeah. Yes, there's a lady at the back there.
It was something you touched on a little bit earlier, actually, about that kind of duality of the, like, how can you say, you know, oh, we weren't poisoning anybody, and yet how great could we, you know, like that. When I hear the news, and I do think that, I think, like, but how can you believe that, you know? And so I try to think, if it was me and I was sitting there and my government was saying X, Y, Z, you know, would I then suddenly start believing the BBC over here? But so I guess I just always assumed that maybe they, you know, the information we got and the information that they get in Russia is somehow different, you know. And so I guess I just wanted to see if you actually think there is that dual. I mean, the question of how on earth would that ever get resolved is not one I'd want to pose to you, because it's almost impossible to answer. But from a culture, you know, you've got a more of a cultural insight into sort of what's going on.
I don't know if, I mean, certainly what they see on TV in Russia is very different from what we would see here. And I think in both cases, you know, we're not no narrative is completely unbiased, right? We all come from a cultural perspective, and no information is without that tinge. But I wonder if, Bridget, you think that this sort of public-private dichotomy that you spoke about in the Soviet Union was like a sort of practice run for this weird post-truth world that we're all living in.
Yeah, I remember when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, I went to a conference in Armenia from Moscow that summer, and the air hostess was very nice. She said, "Oh, come up, look in the cockpit. You can watch the pilot." And so we sat there chatting, and at a certain point, we sort of, very friendly. And she said, "Come on, tell me, why was it that the Americans invaded Afghanistan? Just in December 1979." And I wanted to say, no. It was the Soviets, not the Americans. And so, I mean, there is a bit of that now. You get the sort of feeling that, you meet people who say, "Oh, but clearly it was Porton Down." I mean, look, it's Salisbury. It's right next to Porton Down. The logical thing is the poison came from there, clearly. And, if you're on one or other side of the divide, it is a bit like the looking glass. It depends which way you look at it. So it's an interesting thing about propaganda, isn't it? And it certainly made me think about how in the late Soviet era, because so many things didn't stack up in the Soviet Union, so many things were clearly lies. Our marvellous grain harvest, we have done better than ever, shops are empty. You can kind of tell it's not true. That nowadays it's just much harder. And modern technology makes it hard too.
The more information we get, the harder it is to figure out what's going on.
So I think that people have... I think there are more people in our society who say, "I don't know what to think" as well. I'm not sure I really believe what I'm being told.
Somebody a couple of years ago in Russia told me something. I was asking a similar question to them that you were asking just now. And they said to me about watching Russian TV, they said, "We don't really watch Russian TV to find out what's going on. We watch Russian TV to find out what the people who matter are thinking. Because that's a really important thing to know if you live in a society like ours." And I thought that was a very sensible answer to that question. Yes, there's a gentleman over there.
Yeah, I was interested by a comment about the transition period. So, talking about the political system, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the liberal democracy were at the peak in the West, and now they question. But the Russians have gone directly from one system with another without trying liberal democracy. So, what is it from the people's point of view? What is it that made them not interested at all and rejecting that system? And where do we go from here?
I think when the Soviet Union collapsed, they rather hoped it would happen very quickly, and it didn't. The 90s were very painful. And it was very difficult to unravel 70 years of this terrible communist experiment. And many people suffered a lot. Lots of people, in a normal society, they'd have lost their job. But this was, a world where there was no welfare state. So they went to work, but they weren't really paid. Or they might be given a bag of oranges or a slab of meat. Life was terrible. You couldn't get medicines. I had friends who died early because of lack of medical care at that time. Everyone was traumatized. I remember talking to a representative from the World Health Organization who said, if you look at the shrinking of the Russian population in the period between 1986 and 1996, it had gone down by, 1 million or something. He said, you normally only see that in a war zone. It was terrible attrition on ordinary people, and they kind of bore it. They went to their dachas and they dug potatoes to eat because there was no other way to do it. And that has informed their view of Putin.
And of us, because we said it would all be fine. It's going to be fine.
So they thought Putin came, the oil prices went up, their economy did better, he put up pensions, salaries were doing better, you could get good jobs. And they want that, and they want to keep that. His problem is he's always running against himself. So every time he runs in an election, or people look at how their life is going, and inflation is going up, and jobs are not as good, and now he wants people to wait longer till they get their pension, and they're feeling disillusioned with Putin because it's not as good as it was in 2008. But that does explain, I think, the terrible 90s, why words like democracy and liberal became dirty words in Russia. They felt disillusioned. They felt these were empty promises. So that's one thing. That's one thing. The other is, as I said, I think you have to think about these deeper cultural currents, and monarchy, I think, is a very important one in Russia, and they lost a sense of what held them together. And they went through this trauma. You know, you thought your aunt in Ukraine lived in the same country as you. Suddenly you need a visa to go and see her overnight. You know, it's very destabilizing. So they feel that having a Tsar is a comfort, makes them feel better about themselves. The third thing is that a lot of things have changed in Russia since the end of the Soviet Union, and maybe they haven't got liberal democracies that you see in Western Europe, but they've got a hell of a lot more than they used to have. Russians are much better informed. They can travel, and admittedly they need the money, but they can. And you just couldn't travel in the Soviet Union.
A lot of them have the money.
Yeah, but you go to Siberian cities, and there are travel agents who, you know, sell you a little vacation in Turkey or in Malaysia or in Egypt in the winter. It's fantastic in comparison to what it used to be. You couldn't even leave your town. People can get the books and the videos. They can be connected to the world we're in. They feel connected, and they are connected. And a lot of them have left and come here to study or work and are informed. And that is also affecting the country because they send information back, whether it's by private email or some of them work for news agencies that feed back into Russia. It's not a closed space anymore. And that has had a profound effect, I think, on modern Russia, which is good news. And there are lots of things, practices that were brought in the 90s, which maybe didn't work very well, but they've set the seeds for something which could bear fruit later. So there was a big discussion about free press, and they invented a law on the press, which actually wasn't a bad law. It's just that it was never followed. But it's there. And I mean, there are other things. There's the idea that elections should be free. I mean, that they should be, your vote should be a private vote, a secret ballot. Well, now there's a lot of intimidation on people from their workplaces to go and vote, because most of all, Putin's worried about turnout because there's no other viable candidate. So the real test of how Putin does in the election is how many people bother to go and vote at all at the moment. People are under pressure, but I don't think that they've lost this sense that they should have the right to choose their leaders. They don't believe they can make them accountable at the moment. But I don't believe, I'm a long-term optimist on Russia, that in time, if the right decisions are made, that this is an option that, you know, it could develop. It's just, it was 70 years, and Russian democracy hadn't really been sorted out. You know, there were only the germ of it before that. How many years of Russian tsars and autocracy before that? It's just going to take a long time.
There's a wonderful story about the 2011 parliamentary elections, which were widely falsified because United Russia, Putin's party, didn't do very well. And so on results night, the news editors of the television channels were phoned up from the Kremlin and told what percentage they were supposed to report had voted for United Russia in each of these provinces. So they all took the call, and they all knew that they had to do this, otherwise they'd be out of a job. That's the way it worked. But they asked the question, okay, and what numbers should we give for the other parties? And they were like, oh, we don't care about that. Just report. So you had all these fantastic things where they would put it up on the graphic, and they would add up to 146%, because of course they inflated the figures for United Russia, but not deflated the other figures. So these are mini acts of dissidence that you know, from people working in state television. So it's not all monolithic. You know, there are people who care about this stuff, and they're like, this is nonsense, and we're not going to have it. And if we possibly can, we're going to show that it is.
So one last historical thought. So, you know, why did the Soviet Union end? It ended because a leader died, Brezhnev. And then it took a few years before Gorbachev came along, but eventually a leader came who did something different. And, you know, why did Stalinism end? It ended because Stalin died. And then, you know, 3 years later, Khrushchev was denouncing him in his secret speech, and he and his prime minister were coming to Britain on a visit. The photo's downstairs. And there was a thaw for a year. It didn't last, but it set the seeds for something later. So when does the current situation in Russia end? It ends when Putin goes. And then who knows what will happen? But all sorts of things could happen.
Can I post a counter thought to that? And then we probably need to wrap up. But the guy that I've been doing this series about, Vladislav Surkov, Putin's Rasputin, the hidden hand of Putinism, the inventor of Putinism, he has a different job now. He sort of slightly runs the war in Ukraine. But he's a much diminished figure. He used to be the second most powerful man in Russia, but he's not anymore. And you don't hear much from him. And I was trying to get an interview with him for this series, and of course, no. But on his unofficial spokesman, just as I was putting this thing together one day, I just pinged me a link on my phone, and I click on it, and it's Surkov. He's written an article, and his take on that exact point that you just made there is quite the opposite. He says, Putinism will long outlive Putin. and he would say that because it's his system. So Putinism will long outlive Putin. And you all in the West are going to end up living under it too. So, so there you are. That's
two futures.